Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining in. I know some people are going to be trickling in over time. So again, if you see me looking to the side, it's because I'm letting them in. And if we can just take off your cameras, and you're going to be muted, unfortunately. It's not that I don't want to hear what you have to say. It's just that it's going to help us keep the conversation going. And you can use the chat box in the side. My name is Erika Lougheed. It says in the side, host, NDP host, and you can put in any questions to the side, and I'll try to address them at the end of the webinar. And so I was just saying that I can't believe how prominent and relevant this conversation is right now. It feels incredibly timely to have this deep conversation on food and agriculture. And on that note, I really would like to welcome our two panelists, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves. So go ahead, John.
Hi, my name is John Vanthof. I am the Deputy Leader of the Ontario NDP, the MPP for Timiskaming-Cochrane, and the Ag Critic for the Ontario NDP. I've been that since 2011, and before the 32 years before that, I was a dairy farmer, and I also grew some crops, cash crops to sell. That's me.
Fantastic, thank you. Peggy?
Hi, hello, bonjour, ami. Thank you for having me. My name is Peggy Bailliee. I am co-owner of Three Forks Farms. We're a mixed farm in Warren, Ontario, actually moving to Manitoulin in the present moment. We grow a variety of different crops. I'm also a seed saver and seed producer in the region. As well as I have the fortunate opportunity to work with organizations and businesses around Northern Ontario to help them fulfill their local food goals. So I work as a local food consultant in a variety of different capacities, working around food distribution and local food business planning. So I'm happy to be here and happy to be part of this conversation.
Fantastic, thank you. So I'm going to be asking the panelists some questions. Again, at the end, you can leave some space at the end if you have any part that you want in the chat box. You can message me directly and we can see if we can address it near the end. And I think we'll get started. So the first question I'm going to bring to you, John, first. From your perspective, what are the main challenges as the critic for agriculture and food and rural development presented by COVID-19 right now?
I'd say from each side of the food perspective, I think since COVID-19 is probably the first time that many Ontarians have ever seen an empty shelf in a grocery store. And that's something that we're going to have to be cognizant of as the impact of COVID-19 rolls through this whole year. And from the producer side, that the producers can maintain stable income so that they can keep farming, because food security depends on both the consumer and the producer and the whole chain in between. Thank you.
And Peggy, as a food system consultant, what can you add to that conversation?
Yeah, like just to build a little bit on what you're saying, John, I totally agree with what you're saying. I think what the COVID-19 has really brought to light is that, you know, from my perspective, like the centralized food distribution system is really just making it really challenging for people to access food right now. And so what we built, what is considered a highly efficient system, actually doesn't really work for sustainable regional food systems. So it really does make it challenging to support regional and local producers. It definitely, it really supports an efficient model for bigger corporations, but maybe not as much for smaller or just regional food producers. You know, I think what we're seeing in particular right now with, you know, a majority or a large proportion of our beef in Canada, for example, comes from one meat processing plant in Alberta. So that's just one example of how this is a major challenge. And I think we're definitely going to see the ripple effects of how that's going to trickle down with more food shortages coming through. And I think there's more opportunities for us to look at how we can adjust our food distribution system to really better support local producers and regional food systems.
Thank you. Peggy, on that note, what are the central concerns from food producers and food consumers? So a little bit more expanding on that from the food producer and then from the food consumer standpoint.
Well, I think that, what I've definitely seen is that from the consumer perspective is that consumers are really concerned about the long supply chains. So, the long supply chains that we built, the distribution system, the export-based food supply chain that we have is of great concern. So all these hands and all of these different people and places that are touching our food is of major concern. And what people are more concerned about is like less hands, the more direct relationships that they can have with their food, the more safer it is. And I agree with that, like 90% of the time, I think that is more important. And we've definitely seen that that has been a positive thing as we've seen, local food purchasing going through the roof. Like people have really been moving towards buying more local food and moving towards trying to find and search out local producers, which has been great. I, as a seed producer, has been seeing seed purchases really I can't even believe how much seed we've sold this year. It's kind of been incredible. And we're really excited to see that people are taking to growing their own gardens. I think going back though, I think that we're still to that food shortage piece though, I think that we're not quite sure. And I think consumers are really concerned about like what we're going to see around food shortages. In particular, as we're going to continue to see more labor shortages coming out of places like Arizona and California, that are major producing areas where a majority of our produce that's imported into Ontario is coming from, and then also those centralized meat plants in Alberta. So that's from the consumer perspective. From the producer perspective, I think, we deal with I think most producers deal with razor thin margins. And I think that we have a tremendous amount of uncertainty right now. And any minor market fluctuations can have major impacts to our bottom line and to our survival. So there's a lot of uncertainty for us. I think the government's doing a lot of what they can to support us in the best way they can. But right now, I'm really concerned about the health and well-being for my staff and for my husband and I, because, God forbid, if we should get sick or any of our staff should get sick, we would have to shut down our farm and quarantine for 2 weeks. And in the middle of the season, that would be very, very difficult. And I don't know how we would recover from that, let alone like build more our consumer confidence after having to, quarantine and shut down our operation. There's definitely some concerns that we have to adjust, and it's a big and kind of terrifying time, to be quite honest, but we're adapting and we're doing our best to stay strong and get through it. And we thankfully have community support that is standing by us through this all. So that's great.
Thank you very much. John, do you have anything to add about the central concerns from food producers and food consumers?
I agree with everything that Peggy said, particularly with the way our food system works. Usually there's always a part of the world that's having a problem producing food, and you import or export based on how our current system works. And so if we do produce vegetables in Southern Ontario, if we have a bad tomato year or then we can just import them from somewhere else. But with the pandemic, everyone is having a bad year. So you can't really predict where we can import or what we can export, because Canada is a net food exporter in many products. So it's very concerning that this market upheaval that has forced the dumping of milk might force the euthanization of animals in this country. It's happening now in the States, that this may continue. And that's very concerning. It's concerning from the consumer side, but very concerning from the producer side, because margins are razor thin and no one is prepared for this.
I know I just have a relevant question here in the chat box that could follow up from that, if you don't mind, John. But how can large producers who rely on imported workers manage to have enough power, human power, to produce food?
So that is a very good question. So now that there are a lot of people, because the economy has, for lack of a better word, stopped, there are people available to work, and that's one partial solution. But it's not quite as simple as that. Many of these people are highly trained to do their jobs, so they're going to need to be trained. And when the economy restarts, as we've heard, our people, the Premier today was talking about economy restarting. So a lot of that potential labor force will go back to their regular jobs. So some big producers, and not just big producers of all sizes, are not going to harvest the crops that they normally would, or they're not planting as much as they normally would because they're already foreseeing that they are going to have a shortage in tending those crops and in harvesting those crops. So that in itself is going to play a big role in how much crop is available this fall and through the winter.
Thank you. Some good questions. So I'm going to put my next question to John again. Consumers are certainly familiar with auto insurance, and we've seen some action by the government around insurance rates and rebates, but what about farming? It's a busy time of year right now with decisions about planting. What are your main concerns about surrounding crop insurance program and business risk management program?
Okay, so that's, we're going to try and make this as simple as possible. There are two main types of insurance that are offered through the Ontario government. It's a partnership between the farmers, the feds, and the Ontario government. One is crop insurance. Basically, a farmer can buy a crop insurance to insure themselves against natural disasters of crops, flood, hail, wind, stuff like that. You can insure yourself against that. The other one is business risk management. So for crops that are non-supply managed, so anything that's not dairy and not feathers like eggs or chicken, you can also insure yourself against market fluctuations, which are happening now. If all of a sudden you have beef for sale, but no processed plant is willing to take it, your beef is basically lost a lot of value. The issue with both those, with the crop insurance program, is, and the previous question is a really good example, farmers, specifically like vegetable farmers, for example, access to labor is very important to them. So in a COVID pandemic, if labor, just like Peggy mentioned, if she gets COVID, they're in big trouble. Well, if your labor force gets COVID, you're not going to get your crop harvested. Is that a natural disaster or not? And farmers want to know if crop insurance would cover that. And they haven't been given an answer. And that creates uncertainty. When you create uncertainty, farmers think of something else to grow. And with business risk management, it's the same issue. It's a good program, but it was capped. So the Ontario government covers up to 40% of the difference of the assessed value, but they capped it at 100 million total. So in the case of a beef calf last year, if the government guaranteed an extra $250 at their 40%, it actually turned out to be $50 because it was prorated. So again, farmers are going, whoa, they're already risking weather, they're already risking a lot of things, and the government needs to step up and actually make those programs are there. They don't have to reinvent them. They just have to fund them properly. And we're pushing very hard for that to happen. Farmers, like everyone in society today, their world's been turned upside down. Everyone needs as much certainty as possible. These programs exist and they need to provide more certainty.
Thank you. Peggy, do you have anything to add to that?
No, that's great. I don't know a whole lot about the insurance program, so I'm glad John's talking about it.
Fair. You don't have to have all the answers. It's okay. My next question is directed to you, Peggy. So I certainly remember this, but most people in rural communities remember a time when food was grown, produced, and processed within a few square kilometers of their homes. This pandemic seems to have a renewed consumer interest in knowing where food comes from. With the increased intention of the importance of our local food systems, what are the main challenges around production, marketing, and distribution?
It's a huge topic, and I could probably talk about it for a long time. There's a lot of pieces to that puzzle, and I spend a significant amount of my time trying to work that out. I think, you know, definitely the silver lining of this pandemic is this renewed interest in local food, and I think that there's an incredible amount of innovation that we're seeing coming out of local producers and producers trying to adapt and innovate to address and try and find ways to get food to people and to work to find access to markets and adapt. So I commend all of the innovation that the producers are doing right now to like make it work. I think, you know, beyond this pandemic, when we start thinking about how we're going to continue to support greater food access in the long term, I think we really need to start thinking about things like medium scale infrastructure. You know, things like farmers markets are great and they're important pieces of infrastructure to help people scale up, but things like, you know, our grain mills, our co-ops are really important parts of allowing farmers to scale up. Regional food hubs are processing facilities. So all of this processing infrastructure is so integral to agriculture. You know, historically, and John would know more about this than I do as a former dairy farmer, but, you know, our region used to be a very prolific dairy producing region, and a lot of our dairy processing infrastructure is no longer in this region. And that's just one example of some of the medium scale infrastructure that's no longer in this region that is so integral to supporting our local food producers. And so I think we need to really start thinking about how we can support that. The second thing I think is directly from a consumption perspective is you know, meat production. So right now, for a meat producer to be able to sell meat into a grocery store, so any of the standard grocery chains, it has to be processed in a federally inspected meat plant, on basically under most trade arrangements, right? Or most contracts for the grocery stores. And so in my personal opinion, I think that the actual inspection system in the Ontario processing plants, the meat processing plants, surpasses that of the federal processing plants, but that's my personal opinion. But what I've seen is it's an incredible inspection program. And I think that there needs to be an adjustment to that, those contracts or those procurement contracts that allow for Ontario processed meat to be able to go into grocery chains. I think there's a great opportunity there. And I think it would really definitely allow for local food producers to seize that opportunity and for us to see more local meat in our regional stores. And then furthermore, I think there is another piece, and I don't know a whole lot about this, and maybe I'm stepping into my realm, but I think that there is some barriers that we have around opportunities for public policy to support municipal, like from the municipal, provincial, and federal governments to have procurement policies that push for regional food purchases. And I know that there are some trade restrictions that limit our ability to like actually prioritize regional foods. So I think that if we really want to see a major shift in local food, if we can actually have government and our institutions prioritizing regional food purchasing, it would make a major shift in supporting local producers and supporting the scaling up of and access to markets for local producers, which I think is really the next piece, because we really need to have more medium scale markets for our producers to access if we need to have more producers meeting that demand.
Thank you, Peggy. I know I recognize that as a big question. John, are you able to tackle some of that? And just another question in the chat box that you might be able to answer in part of your answer is, you know, do you think the Canadian and Ontario government also understands the seriousness of the problems inside that food chain? So there you go. answer all the questions.
The Ontario Canadian government, I hope so, but I'm not sure. And I'm not trying to be partisan or be. I'm not 100% sure. Getting back to one of Peggy's points, and that is access to local producers to the grocery chains, and specifically on. We had a long discussion about this on Twitter a few nights ago with a few beef producers. That's not a restriction from any government level. So provincially inspected meat can be sold in a retail grocery store. That is a contract by big grocery and big processor. And basically, it's easier for a big grocery chain to negotiate with Cargill than it is to negotiate with the corner butcher shop. That's what that is. And that's a really tough one. That's, if you think about when you started your question, we can all remember when all food was local, and most of us can remember that, but where local food's coming back, and I think that is the one silver lining that is going to give a big boost to local producers, local food, is this COVID-19. But our whole society has changed. 98% of people used to grow food, used to live in the country. Now 2% do. So I live 6 months a year in downtown Toronto when I'm in the legislature, and it's hard to talk about local food at Bay and Dundas or Yonge and Bay, right? So you need a balance. But local is always better. I'm a big supporter, but the food chain changed when our society became urban. Right? When it became easier to freeze big quantities of food, it became easier to ship big quantities of food. It became easier cheaper to process in large quantities. There is advantages in economies of scale, but there is risks. And what COVID-19 is pointing out is the risks. And one thing, we're very lucky in the area where we live in Northeastern Ontario. We're one of the few areas we actually have the capacity to produce. We have capacity to produce way more food than we can consume, but we have a balance of enough consumers and lots of capacity. So we actually have a pretty good recipe to develop an even stronger local food market. Like, the building blocks are there, and COVID-19 in that way is actually going to help us that way.
Erika, can I just build on that a little bit, if you don't mind?
Thank you.
Yes. And yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad you clarified that, John. You're so right about it is a contract thing within the grocery chains, and I'm so glad you said that. I think that the furthermore is that on that note is, even if we were to solve that problem tomorrow, if we were to take full carcasses into those grocery chains, there wouldn't be anyone that would know how to cut them. It would be very few people that would know how to cut them down, right? Yep. So there's also like a skills shortage also, and we are even seeing that in our own processing facilities here in the north. Is, there's just not that knowledge of even how to process that stuff. And so we need to build our own labor force in agriculture, also to support people that have the knowledge and the willingness to work in agriculture in the north and in Ontario, and to see it as a viable career path and want to be part of it. I think that that's definitely a challenge that we face to attract and recruit people that want to be as part of agriculture and that also have those skills.
I agree.
I think that this is a question coming up, John, that I know that many people are very curious to have your opinion on. And Peggy, I invite you to join in afterwards. So, from the Cargill meat plant in Calgary to the poultry plant in Chilliwack to the pork processing plant near Broslow, here in Ontario, food processing facilities have become the latest congregate settings for COVID. Many workers, many of whom are temporary foreign workers or immigrants, are sick. And there's been at least one recorded death. I think there's more now. Yep. As I understand it, and these are some big plants with workers working really close together, side by side. It's difficult work, often not well paid. In some cases, the employers have used coercive tactics to ensure their facilities stay open. It's complex. Promoting local food systems seems like a no-brainer, but at the same time, a lot of energy has been invested in expanding market share abroad. Is it possible to do to do both in a safe and ethical way that doesn't exploit workers in the process?
That is a very tough question. And first of all, I'd like to say that we have a strong food system in Canada, but the strongest system is only as strong as its weakest link. And a crisis on a farm is no different than the crisis of a family whose family member has COVID or has died from COVID in a meat packing plant. And it's become pretty obvious that the big processing facilities are the weak link in the food chain as far as COVID, and they are the weak link in our agricultural sector because Cargill, for example, like, you know, for half your employees to have COVID, obviously there was something wrong at the start. Cargill's not going to like me for that, but obviously there's something wrong. Can it be done? Can these big processors do the job ethically for livestock and for people? Yes, I firmly believe that they can. The challenge, and it's a big challenge, is that food is we're focusing on local food, and we should on this show, but food is a global commodity. And so beef, for example, if we only focused on local beef, we are going to lose beef producers because we produce more beef than, in many cases, we consume. So you have to be able to compete. And it's going to be, there are going to have to be decisions made, and hopefully they're made worldwide, or we're going to have to make decisions how to do this, to do a more ethical job for your employees. It is going to cost more money. That there's no, you know, one of the reasons that it transmits so quick in big plants is people work side by side. And because you need to get so many jobs done on the assembly line. So if you're going to move people farther away, you need a longer assembly line, you need to go slower, right? Your capacity is lower. It's not an easy question. It's a question I pose to beef producers all the time, because beef producers are very strong supporters of local food, but they're also very export oriented. Like, that's a big difference between, so there's 200 different crops and types of products in Ontario, but there's two main differences. And one is, I'd say there's three, because I think local is a different beast again. But supply managed only focuses on the Canadian market. If the Canadian market wants more milk, farmers produce more. If they want less, farmers produce less. And same with chicken, same with eggs, turkey, right? But all the other commodities are export based. So the grains, oil seeds, pork, beef are all export based. And they decide when dairy decided to only go local, it's Canadian, but dairy is, you know, big local. The other commodities didn't do that. They love to serve local, don't get me wrong, but they're export oriented. So their challenge is to do these jobs at a price point that is going to be able to compete on the markets they have to compete against. That's a tough job. If everybody raises the bar, then, you know, the trick is to raise the bar and do the job right for your employees. Because I think it's a travesty that, you know, what happened in Cargill shows like that is a travesty. That's as big a travesty as is happening in long-term care. And we've had our second person die at Cargill, right? Half your employees Like that's, but it's not just Cargill. It's a risk in all big meat packing plants. But their challenge is to be able to, how are they going to compete with the world? And it's a tough question, because they're going to take farmers, if they're only going to produce locally, and I'm talking locally as in Canada, you are, in some cases, are going to have a lot less market. And and you're going to have to fight world trade agreements, and that's why we're always fighting, supply management's always having to fight to stay alive, because the rest of the world does not like the fact that we protect the dairy market. So don't know if I've answered it. It's possible. It's going to be tough. It's not just a case of tougher regulations. We need them. We need them, but we have to also realize what the ramifications are for the industry.
Thank you, John.
I got it.
No, it's a big one. Peggy, what can you add to that?
That's a big shell to crack. Yeah, I think I work very deeply in the sector, and that's really built on like the cooperative food sector, and I have to speak from that perspective a little bit, because I think if your question was, is there a safe and ethical way to look at this in the future, and when I think about how things could change or how things could be done differently in the future, and I think about opportunities, I think I agree. And I think that there is a place for export agriculture in Canada. I think that it's an important part of agriculture in Canada. I think that Canada plays an important role in feeding the rest of the world, and we should continue to play that role. Like, I don't think that should ever change. I think that we should continue to feed ourselves and export our excess and have that role. And I love our supply management system, and I love our export system. I do think that we should, maybe prioritize our feeding ourselves first and then export our excess, but that's my own philosophical and economic perspective. But, I think that these are questions I think about, our economic systems perhaps, and priorities, like corporate priorities. In the cooperative system, which I work very closely in, priorities around labor is a core priority, and taking care of your employees and your workers is critical. And priorities of the people who are engaged in your work are held at a higher regard than profits. Not to say that profits aren't super important, profits can totally happen, but everything along the line has to be held equally. And I feel like sometimes in some of these systems, profits are held more importantly than the people that are making the work happen. And I think maybe a readjustment of these priorities could maybe avoid this from happening in the future.
If I could add something to that, I'll give you a real life example what farmers face. So when we had the BSE crisis, I can't remember the exact year, but when BSE was identified in the Canadian herd and the Americans shut the border, and I was farming at the time, and I sold a cow the week before and it was $900, and I sold a cow the week after BSE hit and it was $90. So we had a cooperative, which is still there, Gencor, and Gencor started up a meat processing plant to help out the farmers. It was cooperatively owned. They, did everything. What happened is when the market opened up and the big processors could offer more per pound than Gencor, the farmers did what was economically right for them at the time, and they didn't. Gencor took a beating, and Gencor, the processing plant had to close because it couldn't compete with the prices that the big processors were giving to buy their market back. You know, so and I learned a big lesson from that. I got to give shout out to Gencor, because Gencor also bought Thornlow cheese, and Gencor was the reason that we still have Thornlow cheese today. They sold it again to another dairy cooperative, just sold to Bailliee, but Gencor has taken risks that no one else would, time after time. And but with meat processing, it's a tough business. And
beef is hard.
Farmers go where they get the most per pound. that's and I don't blame them. And the processors know that. And so it's a real tough gig.
I feel like we're definitely dancing around the conversation of capitalism, that's for sure, and the race. And maybe the general race to the bottom when it comes to labor and keeping labor cheap, and that's really hard to compete with. So I appreciate both of your perspectives. They don't need to be the same, and that's what really adds to the context of the conversation. So thank you very much for that. All right, back at it. So Peggy, this is for you. I think it's a really good pertinent question for you. So what choices can consumers make to help local producers? And what needs to happen for our local grocery stores to carry and promote local food?
I think, consumers just need to realize that they have the right to have to ask for the food that they want and that they need. There's no reason that if consumers want local food, they should have it in a hospital if they're being treated there. They should have it at a hockey game if they're going to watch a hockey game. They should have it wherever they want, and they should ask for it. And I think the most empowering thing they can do is ask for it and demand it wherever they feel that they want to have it. And I think it's through consumer demand that it will force the purchasers to make choices to start to bring on more local producers. And we're definitely seeing a change. So we're seeing local grocery stores have made a huge shift in the last year and a half, 2 years. We're seeing more smaller producers getting into grocery stores. We're seeing a real changing in the pattern and the way that their purchasing is happening, which is great. And we're really excited to see that. And we just hope to continue to see that change. But I think that the biggest thing is for consumers to really ask for the product where they want it. And like in restaurants in particular, in Sudbury, so one of the things that we realized is that if you go to Sudbury is a potato producing region, right? We have the valley, there's so much potatoes produced. How many restaurants can you go into that are selling valley potatoes? Like any potatoes that are sold, they're produced in the valley? Like not that many, but are actually openly promoting the fact that they are using valley potatoes. And they should be like screaming and saying like, these are valley potatoes, and people should be excited about that. So I think we should be asking for that food wherever we're going. And I think that's the most empowering thing that people can do.
Thank you, John.
100%. I have had so many uncomfortable conversations with restaurant managers when I ask them, so is this local, or where does exactly this come from? Right? And the consumer is king. And if you keep asking, and you know what, the grocers who I've talked to, it's not that they don't want to do it. If they can have a reason to do it, they are going to try. And restaurants the same. But there has to be a demand, and in some cases, you're also going to have to, and quite frankly, you're going to have to pay sometimes a little bit more for certain things, because some things can be grown in bulk cheaper and transported cheaper. And if people tell me that can't be, I said, well, so how come everybody's buying from? And I'm not, because you've already seen how good I am with technology. I don't buy from Amazon. But Amazon and HelloFresh and all these things are all the opposite of local. So you have to keep pushing, and you have to be able to be willing to push, and sometimes willing to pay a couple cents more to get local.
Thank you. Thank you. So the next question here, I'm going to point it to John. This pandemic has been often referred to as the Great Revealer. What are your hopes coming out of this pandemic and how it can shape society for the better?
Yeah, I think it has been the great revealer. We have seen the weaknesses in our society. We have seen that sometimes the people who take the greatest risk, who provide the most, the services that are worth the most, like people who take care of our cherished loved ones in long-term care, people who actually do the tough job of working in food processing facilities. Sometimes they are not properly respected by society. And I think if there's one thing that we can learn from this is that sometimes I'm not knocking CEOs, but sometimes the CEO isn't the most important person in the system. Sometimes it's the person, you know, taking care of the person or actually, you know, working, processing the food. And if there's one thing that I hope that we take out of COVID-19 is to put actually the true worth of the people who are for value them at what value them, not just financially, but personally, value them for what they're worth. Like, it wasn't very long ago when I was in the legislature of Ontario and our premier removed paid sick days from this province, right? And now we're saying, well, the one thing you can't do is come to work sick. Well, a good thing so you could help with that is actually have a paid sick day, right? But 6 months ago, we were saying it, but the government of the day, and still the same government, was making it harder. And we have to make sure that when we are over the true crisis, and we could get a second wave, but when we sit down and actually, that we just don't quietly slip back into the same, we can't slip back and do the same things the same way, because then this will truly, the people who've lost their lives in this and lost loved ones, and it truly will be for naught if we don't realize what people's true value is in society.
It's hard to, yes, I agree. It reminds me of the conversation we had earlier on with respect to labor. And I know Franz touched on this and Jamie, but just the value of the worker, and also, you know, part-time precarious work, the stress that people are under. We don't have, I'm just echoing what Jamie said, but we don't have a jobs problem, we have a careers problem. And it's just, you can really see the value of work right now. Peggy, what are your hopes coming out of this pandemic?
You know, I have so much hope from this. I feel there's so many silver linings. You know, it's a terrible situation, and I know this is affecting people in terrible, terrible ways. But I feel like it is through these kinds of situations, it's only through these kinds of situations and that you see how broken something is, that it forces you to fix it. And so, you know, when I have a conversation with a colleague today about like how broken the food access program is in parts of Northern Ontario, and like how challenging it is for local food producers to get products to different areas, and I feel like government is stepping up. I feel like everybody is stepping up right now, and everyone is chipping in, and everyone is doing everything they can to say, like, what can we do? How can we address this? And what can be done? And I feel like everyone really wants to be part of a solution. And I feel like all of the things that are going to come out of this can be really incredibly powerful. And it's really going to be exciting to see the potential of what's going to happen. I'm so excited to see how much food is going to get produced in Northern Ontario as a result of this, because of this increased demand and people turning to local food. I can't wait to see what the next couple of years are going to be. And I hope to see more and more fields being in production of all sorts of different crops in the north, and seeing more people just have access to good food. and more seed, lots more seed.
Thank you. So, you know, the news isn't always great, as we were, you know, mentioning earlier, especially with respect to Cargill. How are you both personally navigating this on your own personal level? How are you navigating it, John?
So I'm going to sound like a bit of a hypocrite here. So I made my living my whole life farming, but we never grew a garden. We produced a lot of milk. We produced a lot of beef, and we bought our vegetables, we are. Oh, we didn't buy our seeds from Peggy. I'll do that next year. We are also seeing the value in you know, being closer to home, seeing how your own. I have faith in our food system, but you know, we've always supported local growers, but we're going to be a bit more self-sufficient, and we have more time. I'm working from home. My wife was a server in a restaurant, so she's at home too, and I like to. It's even the farmers are going back to the land. So that's how we're. that's what we're doing.
That's interesting. Peggy, do you have any? How are you personally navigating this?
It definitely comes in waves. I think is like there's like definitely good days and there's bad days, and it's, you know, we have to take them as they come. And I have a great philosophy around lots of hugs for my dogs and my husband, and on those days when they're bad. But and I also really try to take lots of walks and get outside, because I think that's really just being outside and away from technology has also been very helpful to like just realize there's so much more in this world. Like there's birds, and having the birds coming back this spring and seeing life blooming up and everything turning green has been refreshing this week. And I think it's going, as things get warmer, I think things are going to get easier. And I think it's just taking those moments to appreciate what nature's giving it to us is really helpful to get through it.
If there's one thing I have the unique opportunity of living 6 months a year on the 23rd floor in downtown Toronto because of my job. And we are so incredibly blessed to live in Northern Ontario. I cannot say that enough. And I never knew that. I never truly knew that until, and don't get me wrong, I have kids who live in downtown Toronto, and there's a lot of things in downtown Toronto, but boy, we are blessed to be close to the land, to have the opportunity to know our neighbors, have the opportunity to buy local, to grow local. It's a blessing that you don't know. Some things are priceless, and that's one of the things that's priceless.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So I've addressed a few questions in the chat box. I'm just going to let everyone know that if you have any more follow-up questions, we can open them up to the panelists now. I do know that, John, someone wrote here about dairy farming and it opening up to this, with dairy products coming from the US, how do you feel it will challenge our farmers?
So under the new trade agreement, there is more dairy coming from the States. The one thing that the dairy system does in Canada, because of supply management, dairy farmers pool their profits and pool their losses. So it's never good to lose a market, but because they pool right across the country, individual dairy farmers won't be hurt as badly as they could be if we didn't have the system. So it's never good to lose market, but compared to what farmers on the open market, like in the United States, are facing now, like it's a horror story what's happening to dairy farms in the United States. That's not happening here. We have a much better system. Is it perfect? No. Are farmers going to feel the pain? Yes. because I was a dairy farmer for 32 years and no longer a dairy farmer, and people asked me, I said, if my kids called me up tomorrow and wanted to milk cows, I would start it again tomorrow. I'm a big fan of our system, and we have got a good system, and it's very resilient, and yeah, we'll be there for a long time.
Thank you. Okay, I don't see any more questions in the chat box. I just really want to take a moment to thank you both for joining us. Our riding association, just to give a little plug, is pretty active and making some waves. So feel free to connect with us anytime. If anybody has any other questions, then you can let us know. Thank you. I think that's it for tonight. Thank you very much, everyone.